Newfoundlanders call it the Rock, not affectionately at first. The nickname started as a complaint about the soil, the fog, the endless gray Atlantic pressing against a coastline too stubborn to farm. Over time, it became something else, a badge, proof of isolation, proof that whatever happened on this island, out past the mainland, out past the shipping lanes most of Canada forgot existed, happened differently than everywhere else. Linguists have called Newfoundland English a living fossil, a dialect frozen somewhere around the 1600s, closer to the voices of Shakespeare's London or rural County Waterford than to modern Canadian speech. Genealogists built an entire industry on the idea that this island was a sealed jar. West Country English fishermen on one side of the bay, Irish Catholic families on the other, barely touched by outsiders for 400 years. That story has real evidence behind it. Newfoundland does carry one of the most unusual genetic signatures in North America. Researchers studying the population have documented founder effect diseases here that show up almost nowhere else on the continent at comparable rates. Rare inherited conditions traceable to a small number of original settlers, amplified generation after generation in communities where marrying outside the outport sometimes meant a full day's boat ride. The isolation is not folklore. It is measurable in the DNA of people living in St. John's and Twillingate today. But isolation from a mainland is not the same as isolation from history. And the moment researchers looked closer at what purely English and Irish actually meant on the ground, the picture started to complicate. Because before either group arrived in significant numbers, Newfoundland already had people living along its coasts and rivers. The Beothuk hunters and fishers who had occupied the island for at least 2,000 years, moving between coastal camps and inland caribou grounds with the seasons. Official history tells their story with a disturbingly clean ending. Contact, disease, starvation, conflict over resources with European fishing crews. And then, in June of 1829, a young woman named Shannon died of tuberculosis in St. John's. She is remembered in textbooks as the last of her people. A population that had survived for millennia was declared, in a single sentence, extinct. It is one of the most complete indigenous disappearances ever recorded in North America. No other case looks quite like it. And for nearly 2 centuries, that has been treated as the final word, which is exactly what should make anyone pause, because final words in population genetics have a habit of not staying final. Shannon death was documented almost obsessively for its time. A British magistrate named William Epps Cormac had spent years trying to make contact with the Beothuk before she was captured. The last confirmed member of her community found alive, starving, near Red Indian Lake in 1823. Cormac sketched her drawings, recorded her vocabulary, sat with her as she tried to explain, in a language nobody else around her could speak fluently, what had happened to her family. Her mother and sister died of tuberculosis within months of capture. When Shannon followed 6 years later, colonial authorities in St. John's treated it as the closing of a case file. Her skull was sent to a museum in Edinburgh. Her people, on paper, ceased to exist. But paper and biology don't always agree. Long before Shannon was born, the boundary between Beothuk territory and European settlement had never been as sealed as the official record suggests. French and Basque fishing crews have been working the coast of Newfoundland since at least the 1500s, decades before permanent English colonies took hold. And where fishing crews overwinter, contact happens, whether documented or not. Later, Mi'kmaq communities from Nova Scotia began crossing to Newfoundland in greater numbers, some recruited by French authorities, some migrating independently, establishing settlements on the island's south coast that still exist today in communities like Conn River. The Beothuk avoided the Mi'kmaq as much as they avoided Europeans, according to oral accounts. But avoidance across a coastline that long, for that many generations, is a hard thing to maintain absolutely. Here is where the mystery genuinely deepens instead of resolving. In the early 2000s, a team of Canadian geneticists led by Dr. Anna Duggan sequenced ancient mitochondrial DNA extracted from Beothuk skeletal remains, comparing it against a broader dataset of indigenous populations across the region. The goal was straightforward: confirm the genetic isolation of the Beothuk, understand their relationship to neighboring groups like the Mi'kmaq and the Innu, and close a scientific gap in the historical record. What the results actually showed was more complicated than a clean confirmation of extinction. The Beothuk carried mitochondrial lineages that overlapped, at least partially, with populations still living in the region today, a genetic thread that should not exist if the line had truly ended with one woman in a St. John's hospital bed in 1829. That finding alone does not prove survival. Shared maternal lineages across the wider Algonquian-speaking world are not unusual. Ancestry connections stretching back thousands of years can produce overlap without any recent, undocumented mixing. Scientists studying the data have been careful to say the evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. But it reopened a question that Canadian history had considered settled for nearly 200 years. A question families across Newfoundland's outports, some carrying oral traditions of a great-great-grandmother from the old people, had quietly never stopped asking. The overlap Duggan's team found sent researchers back into an archive nobody had taken seriously for over a century: the oral histories of Mi'kmaq communities on Newfoundland's south coast. Elders in Conn River and surrounding settlements had, for generations, spoken of Beothuk individuals being taken in, adopted, or married into Mi'kmaq families during the chaos of the early 1800s, as starvation and conflict with English settlers pushed the last scattered Beothuk bands toward collapse. Colonial record keepers, focused entirely on tracking a dying race for scientific curiosity rather than survival, had little institutional interest in documenting quiet cases of absorption. A child raised inside a Mi'kmaq household, speaking Mi'kmaq, practicing Mi'kmaq customs, would simply stop appearing in any ledger as Beothuk at all. Extinction, in that light, starts to look less like a biological event and more like a bureaucratic one. The moment a category stopped being recorded, not necessarily the moment the people themselves disappeared. Meanwhile, a separate and much larger genetic project was quietly reshaping what Newfoundlanders understood about their European ancestry too. Researchers working with the Newfoundland and Labrador population, prized by geneticists precisely because of its unusual isolation, began mapping autosomal DNA across thousands of living residents to trace the real proportions behind the English and Irish label. The results confirmed part of the myth and complicated the rest. Irish ancestry in Newfoundland concentrated overwhelmingly from a narrow slice of southeast Ireland. Waterford, Wexford, South Kilkenny turn out to be so genetically concentrated, so undiluted by later migration, that some researchers now argue Newfoundland preserves Irish genetic diversity more completely than parts of Ireland itself, where centuries of continued immigration and internal movement blurred regional lineages that stayed locked in place across the Atlantic. It was, geneticists noted, an accidental time capsule, created not by any effort at purity, but by geography, poverty, and a fishery that gave people little reason to leave. But English settlement, concentrated in outports along the northeast coast, told a messier story than expected. DNA analysis showed clear genetic contributions from French and Basque fishing populations who had worked Newfoundland's waters since the 16th century, a presence largely absent from the island's popular self-image, yet detectable in the genome of families who had no idea a Basque whaler or a French fisherman's descendant sat anywhere in their family tree. Combined with the still unresolved Beothuk mitochondrial overlap, a new and uncomfortable picture began to form. Newfoundland's famous isolation had never meant genetic simplicity. It had meant something closer to the opposite: a small number of founding populations, mixing more than the official record admitted, sealed inside a landscape too remote for anyone outside to notice or care to ask. The final piece of the puzzle, though, would not come from ancient bones or colonial ledgers at all. It would come from a genetic testing kit mailed to an ordinary Newfoundland household, decades after Duggan's original study, that returned a result nobody in that family expected to see. In the years following the original mitochondrial study, commercial ancestry testing spread across Newfoundland the way it did everywhere else, Curiosity more than science, a Christmas gift, a way to confirm what families already believed about themselves. But the island's unusual genetic isolation made those consumer results unusually informative. Population geneticists began quietly cross-referencing anonymized data from Newfoundland users against known Indigenous reference panels, looking for the kind of deep, unbroken maternal signal that would indicate something more than distant, diluted ancestry. A handful of families on the south coast and in pockets of central Newfoundland turned up mitochondrial lineages consistent with the ancient Beothuk samples. Not overwhelming percentages, not headline-making numbers, but present, specific, and traceable to exactly the kind of quiet 18th and 19th century absorption that oral histories had described for generations without documentation to back them. No serious researcher today claims this settles the matter with certainty. Ancient DNA analysis carries real limits, degraded samples, small comparison datasets, and the genuine possibility that shared lineages reflect ancient regional connections rather than recent family ties. The scientific consensus remains cautious. The Beothuk as a distinct cultural and linguistic nation did end, their language lost, their specific way of life extinguished by disease, starvation, and violent conflict with settlers who saw the island as theirs alone to use. That loss is real, and it is not undone by a handful of overlapping genetic markers 2 centuries later. But biological extinction and cultural extinction, it turns out, are not always the same event. And Newfoundland may be one of the clearest cases on the continent of that distinction matching. Shannon-Thith's death ended a nation's independent existence. It did not necessarily end every strand of descent that nation had produced. Some of it folded quietly into Mi'kmaq families, some possibly into English and Irish households too, absorbed so completely that the paperwork simply stopped noticing. That is the answer the DNA actually offers, not a clean confirmation of the postcard myth, and not a tidy reversal of it either. Newfoundland was never the simple, sealed jar of English fishermen and Irish farmers its own folklore describes. It was a narrower, stranger convergence, an Irish population more genetically intact than Ireland's own, an English coastline threaded with French and Basque blood nobody bothered to record, and an indigenous nation declared extinct on a single afternoon in 1829, whose genetic thread may never have fully broken at all. What survives in a place like this was never only accents and surnames. It survives in mitochondria passed silently from mother to daughter for 200 years, indifferent to which column a colonial clerk chose to write a name under. The rock kept its secrets not because nothing happened here, but because almost everything did, layered, mixed, and largely unwritten, waiting for a strand of DNA to finally ask the question the records never did.